Hello there, everyone. This is Sarah from Myosh. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is the topic is driving a positive safety culture. Before I introduce our presenter, please note there will be some polls, so I hope you can all interact with those. If you have any questions, we'll endeavour to answer those at the end of the session. Please use the Q&A panel. I think there's also a chat that will come up, so you can use the chat icon to join in the chat. It's great to have people join in all the time, as you know. And after the session later today, we'll send out some resources that Anthony's going to mention, and also a recording and a podcast, so you can share that with whomever you like. So today's topic is presented by Anthony Gibbs, who's the CEO of Sentis. Hi there, Anthony. Anthony has joined us a few times, and it's always great topics and very good information. So as CEO, Anthony is responsible for leading Sentis on its mission to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. He has worked with thousands of people across hundreds of organisations globally to develop safety culture solutions that support strategy and enable the person component to reach its full potential. So over to you, Anthony. I think we need to put your PowerPoint on.
Oh, it's not on. Okay.
No, it's not.
Oh, we've lost it. Okay.
I was just talking to Anthony about a future topic that some people have raised in feedback, and it's on complacency. And I was saying to him that we do so many webinars now. I'm at risk of getting complacent with using this software.
Tell me that one's working now. Yeah, that's great. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Sarah's mentioned, the topic for today is about driving a positive safety culture. So we're going to dig into some research that Sentis has done over the last few years and look at the drivers of a positive safety culture and also the drivers of a negative safety culture as well, and give us some good opportunities to reflect on what might be happening within our own organisations and what we can choose to do about that. A little bit about Sentis before we kick off. Our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. We do that through the application of psychology and neuroscience to help leaders understand their organisational culture, develop leadership capability, and create greater team alignment around safety. Many of our people, much like myself, are trained in the area of psychology. I actually came from a clinical background originally, and we've applied a range of different psychological techniques to understand culture, understand the drivers of it, and also develop people within the organisation as well. We will be providing a handout with today's webinar, so you'll get this as part of the mail out later on. It provides some useful information and some summary notes that you can jot down on. So please feel free to download that resource. It's a useful one to think about and to potentially share throughout your organisation if there's some items of further interest. So we're going to cover today's topic in 4 steps. We're going to first of all look at what is safety culture, get an overview of safety culture. We're going to provide you with current insights from our own research, and there's a resource we'll provide you again in relation to these insights that you can download and peruse at your own leisure as well. We're going to talk a little bit about what good looks like, so some particular tools that you can apply straight after this webinar, should you choose to start to drive towards a more positive safety culture. And we'll give you also some hints and tips about where to start implementing everything as well. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, lots of interactivity today, lots of polls and lots of opportunity to think about application. I'm going to kick off today's session with a video to, share the experience that we have a lot as we go on to organisational sites. As Sarah mentioned, personally, I've worked with many organisations across Australia, Asia, the US, a range of different, and also the Middle East as well. And what we tend to find is that sometimes it's difficult for leaders to actually understand what's happening in their organisation's culture. So I'll share this video with you. Just make sure that everything's working. Share this video with you, and I'll unpack a little bit afterwards what this means and what this says about cultures that we typically see in organisations.
It's a typical day in your company's processing plant, and safety seems to be looking good from where you stand. As you walk around the site, checking on the various works, you notice people wearing PPE, procedures are being followed, and teams discussing safety during pre-start meetings. From the outside, it looks like working safely is a priority around here, but your data tells you something very different. At the weekly safety meeting this morning, the ongoing high incident rate remains a cause for concern. Something isn't adding up, and you need to figure out why. Daryl works in the processing plant. He is working with his crew when he looks up and notices two leaders approaching from the main office. This can only mean one thing. They are about to conduct a safety observation. He subtly reaches for his two-way radio. "Ducks on the pond," he says into the radio. I repeat, ducks on the pond. Daryl looks around the worksite and sees a flurry of activity. Everyone is quickly putting on their gloves, addressing any obvious hazards, and ensuring they are following the correct procedures. Ducks on the pond is the known code for leader approaching, and everyone knows exactly what they need to do when they hear it across the two-way. With a work culture like this, there's no wonder the data doesn't match the observed behaviour. The challenge from here is to create a culture where people choose to do their work the safe and correct way because they want to, not because they have to. We call this private compliance. A culture where employees see the benefit in doing things the right and safe way, even when no one is watching. Achieving private compliance is key to unlocking a positive safety culture.
Great. Apologies for that little bit of a issue with the video. Thank you, Jeremy, for the heads up. Okay, so we heard a little bit there, or we saw an example there of sometimes what we would call nearly a two-speed culture that many leaders feel that they're experiencing. They sort of go on site and they see people doing the right things, but then other things in their organizational results or outcomes don't add up. And even some of the comments and some of the language that people use and some of the behaviors that they might catch people doing don't line up with the broader sort of perspective. So what this is typically reflective of is a public compliance culture. So as we saw in the previous example, or in the example on in that video, is that a public compliance culture is one where people do safety because of an external element to them, typically leadership and typically or management, and typically it's driven by not wanting to get caught doing the wrong thing and the consequences that are related to that. On the left-hand side there, before that, we see some organizations fall into the counterproductivity side of things as well. This is, again, even more negative than the public compliance. At counterproductive, we tend to see individuals within that organization see the organization is not caring about them and their safety, and therefore they don't necessarily care about what safety means for the organization as well. As we saw in the video, the trick or the opportunity for most organizations is to get the critical mass of culture into the public compliance space at a minimum. Private compliance space at a minimum. In the private compliance space, this is where we move from an external driver of safety to an internal driver of safety. So this is where we tend to see people see that there's something in them for safety. They understand the link between the choices that they make and their ability to get home safe to the things, people, and places that are most important to them. Once we get that foundation right, where people are taking ownership of their safety, we can then push to mateship, and then we can push to citizenship. So at mateship, that's about looking out for our teams, caring as much about my safety as I do about my mates. But going beyond that, it's about having the courage to step up and have that tough conversation with that colleague and to call them out if they're putting themselves in harm's way. And then citizenship is where we tend to see really organizational citizenship type of behaviors, where people see safety of the entire organization as a shared responsibility. We tend to see more of the sorts of behaviors you typically see in a high reliability organization. So high levels of trust, high levels of communication, sharing of learnings, willingness to be vulnerable and learn from mistakes. So sometimes it can be helpful to understand this maturity model, with some real life examples. And the next real life example I'm going to share with you, or the next couple of real life examples I'm going to share with you, one is a not so good example and one is a more positive example. Interestingly enough, you'll probably know the not great example, but you may not have heard of the really good example, but yet they were both exposed to the same conditions, the same set of circumstances, but had a very, very different result when it came to their safety outcomes. So a very well-known disaster is obviously Fukushima. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Fukushima, on the 11th of March in 2011, as a direct consequence of a nearby magnitude 9 earthquake and a 14-meter tsunami, this particular plant was largely destroyed. There was an independent report done into Fukushima, and that found some really interesting information about the causes and drivers of that particular outcome. So, of course, the blame was put on the earthquake, but when the later analysis identified that many of the consequences of that earthquake were largely potentially preventable. So where did the blame lie? Well, obviously a lot of focus was put onto Tokyo Electric Power Company, so TEPCO, and it suggested that they had failed to meet the basic safety requirements, such as risk assessment, preparing for containing collateral damage, and developing evacuation plans. They dug deeper into how that particular plant was run, and they identified that the seawall, which would have largely protected the plant from the tsunami, was shaved to reduce the cost of getting new equipment into the plant. And there were much deeper examples raised by employees about bureaucracy and additional leadership challenges. So some of the quotes that came out of the report were, "What must be admitted very painfully is that this was a disaster made in Japan. Had other Japanese been in the same shoes of those who bear responsibility for this accident, the result may well have been the same. The Fukushima nuclear power plant accident was a result of a collusion between government regulators and TEPCO, and had seen a lack of governance by both parties." And then there was comments about that these operators had betrayed the nation's right to be safe from nuclear accidents. You would have heard one of the comments in there. There was an incident made in Japan. If you dig a little bit deeper, what was actually identified by some people who looked at this particular incident is there was a belief that it was a broader Japanese issue that this incident occurred. So the fundamental causes were found in the ingrained conventions of Japanese culture, a reflexive obedience, a reluctance to question authority, and a devotion to sticking to the program. So it was suggested by some that in fact anyone in the same shoes in Japan would have done the same thing to help make sure they got the results that they were getting. So what the behaviors this drove was quietly fixing mistakes, covering mistakes up, not mentioning anything that ever happened because of the loss of face potential. We're going to challenge that because we actually don't believe that the results of that incident were due to the overarching Japanese culture. And there's actually lots of other research that suggests this as well. We're going to suggest that, yes, there's a broader Japanese culture, but it was possible to have a different type of culture within an operating site, which would have prevented this particular incident. We're also challenging some of the comments here about the reflexive obedience and reluctance to question authority, since it was actually Toyota, a Japanese company, for example, that created the Six Sigma program where anyone could stop the job for an issue at any particular time. But a more relevant example to this is actually Onagawa, which is a Japanese power plant that didn't melt down on the same day. So that was a Japanese power plant that was actually closer to the actual earthquake center. It was shut down following the earthquake in 2011 and was decommissioned in 2018. So as you can see on the map there, it was the closest power plant to the epicenter facing the Pacific Ocean on Japan's north coast. Fukushima was actually roughly double the distance. They experienced also high levels of ground shaking, almost the strongest of any plant affected by the quake, and some flooding from the tsunami that followed. All three reactors at the power plant did, however, successfully withstand the earthquake and the tsunami with that incident. An inspection in 2012 stated that the structural elements of the nuclear power station were remarkably undamaged given the magnitude of the ground motion and the duration of the earthquake. So why were there such different results between Fukushima and Onagawa? Well, a lot of it comes down to the planning and the culture that had been kicked off at the start of the build of that particular site, but then continued on through its operation. Firstly, earthquakes and the related tsunamis were recognised as a risk for both plants when they were getting built. They made the decision at Onagawa, apologies, tripping over that this morning, to first of all build on higher ground. The leadership team had also, at the commencement of the build and throughout the operation of the plant, sought to learn from other global nuclear disasters, and they implemented processes as a result, which meant that they actually built up a higher seawall. They had a lot more thought put into the safety systems and functions as they were designed, and there was such as automatic shutdown, and that meant that there was less damage done. In fact, there were so many positive actions put into the planning of that plant and the operation of the evacuation processes and the related processes that had to go on after that earthquake, that 200 to 300 residents of the town who lost their homes to the tsunami took refuge in the plant gymnasium. So two plants, both experiencing very similar conditions with two very different outcomes. And what we would suggest is that one of the major differences there was the culture that had been created and existed within the operational site. There is no doubt that broader society culture can impact and will impact on the culture of sites, but we've seen it time and time again, and this is just another example. Leadership on sites have such an important impact on how that site does safety, and that is actually reflected very closely in our own Sentis research study as well. So we're going to dig into the data now so you can get a little bit of insights for yourselves as to what drives a positive safety culture. So the research sample that we're going to share with you today is our own research. It covers 73 operational sites across 8 industries. You can see the 8 industries listed on the screen there. It also pulls from 9 different countries. The data was collected through a combination of qualitative and quantitative data collection, and we'll talk about our process and methodology for that in just a moment. But as part of that process, we ran over 562 focus groups. We did a bunch of over nearly 600 hours worth of interviews. We interviewed over 5,000 people. That 21,000 surveys completed, that's actually a stratified sample group. So the actual total number of surveys was over 40,000, but we then stratified the sample group to make sure that no site or organisation was overrepresented. And that's the same with all the data. A bunch of observations and a bunch of cultural themes analysed. We got that data through our award-winning on-site safety evaluation and safety climate survey process. So what we do through this particular process is run a bunch of in-field interactions and serve questionnaires and focus groups to enable us to get qualitative data from people. And then we run a safety climate survey that sits over the top of that to get the quantitative. And what that enables us to do is triangulate that data and provide some really useful insights and information back to leaders and back to sites about where the strength and opportunity areas are, and to give greater context to be able to act on those in an effective way. So we'll dig into the data now. Now, the first bit of data to understand is that the majority of sites that completed our survey are sat within the negative safety culture space. So 86% of sites sat within either counterproductive or public compliance. Now, we're not suggesting that is necessarily representative of all sites, but it's certainly representative of the sites that sought out assistance from us. The sorts of comments that came from these sites were really interesting. I think provide a bit of context for us to reflect on. So safety is important if it doesn't cost money. You come to work and nobody cares about safety. Some of them just don't care about safety procedures. A piece of paper won't stop us from dying. It's a backside covering exercise. you can see some of the negative sentiments that we get out of these less positive safety culture areas. A lot of blame focus on here, a lot of only caring about safety when something goes wrong. Fear-based motives, people are being fired as a result of safety. And you can see as we go through the types of qualitative comments that we've been able to collect from people, and these are real comments that we've taken from people, you can see how this can have an impact on the types of attitudes and beliefs that people start to adopt around safety. So this is where people fall into this counterproductive and public compliance space. In this space, safety is seen, as you could see from those comments, as a ticket flick exercise. It's about cutting corners, taking shortcuts, motivated by not getting in trouble, increased underreporting, so we get people feel less safe to report, so they don't report, they hold on to those incidents or bury them, like we saw in the Fukushima example. There's an increased likelihood of incident and injury. So what we tend to find is that organisations get stuck at this public compliance space because it becomes very much a top-down police mentality to driving a safety outcome. And it's difficult for organisations to understand how to flick into that place where people get the why and the what's in it for me with safety, and they start to take that personal accountability. So that's our goal. Our goal is to look at today, and when we work with organisations, how we initially tip over into that private compliance space where people get the why and the what's in it for me, and then continue that journey up towards citizenship. So let's unpack the data, and let's start off by looking at the top 5 opportunity areas for the sites in that counterproductive and public compliance space. So those 2 more negative safety culture spaces. What this data has shown us is that there's some really clear areas of opportunity for these sites. One is, the first one is, the most significant one identified, is the quality of safety procedures. So what this refers to is a perception that procedures lack value or importance or were too complicated or difficult to implement. Often procedures were seen as focused on serving the company's interest, and the worker was being considered as a distant second. So this drove a perception that that the whole process was just about tick and flick and about the organisation covering itself. So as you can see here, a number of people feeling like they don't see the value, they don't see the importance of these procedures, and not feeling consulted and connected in the process. And that consultation process is such an important one because it also ties in this next item here called safety management commitment. A management safety commitment. Management safety commitment refers to an inconsistent commitment from management, poor prioritization of safety, and a lack of safety leadership skills, especially role modeling, inspiring, motivating, active caring, and collaborating. This drives a perception that leaders do not walk the talk. So again, you can see how the quality of safety procedures and management safety commitment can have a relationship there, because if leaders are making decisions just to get safety out of the way, if they're focusing on safety at some times and not on others, perhaps if there's a breakdown, we've got to get things back online, we turn a blind eye or we crack down when we've got the board on site. These sorts of things send a very clear message about safety. In addition to that, leaders miss a real opportunity when it comes to showing their safety commitment when they don't consult and work with their people to address things like the quality of safety procedures. Again, playing into this at 48% is internal context. So internal context refers to the factors internal to an organisation that impact on safety performance. These factors include areas such as change management, job security, general morale, and perceptions of culture. Now, when these are managed poorly, as it's indicated here, there's a perception that there's knee-jerk reactions from leaders due to poor comms, regular changes in direction, and short time frames to implement change. Now, all of this drives cynicism. So we said that was important today, but it's not important tomorrow. Or people feel like they're caught out of the blue. Often what happens in this space as well is even if leaders do engage in some positive action around safety, they may not communicate that effectively back to the workforce, further perpetuating the belief that that safety isn't valued and that managers aren't committed to safety. The next two are also tied, I think, pretty heavily to the management safety commitment as well. Willingness to report incidents and errors. So this talks to the drivers of underreporting being fear of punishment, lack of a feedback loop, and difficult reporting processes. So the number one there, as you can see, is, well, if I do report something, do I get in trouble for it? And then the next one is, if I do report it, does anything get done about it? And then finally, how do I actually report in the first place? And I've seen some real examples of all of these three play out, as I'm sure many of you have as well. And then finally, employee safety performance. This relates to the fairness surrounding safety performance management and is likely linked to a lack of a balanced approach to safety. So this is a set of circumstances where as a team member, I work safely 99% of the time and hear nothing. But if something goes wrong, or if I'm involved in an incident, then everything hits the fan. Leaders are right up, doing inspections, extra time on site, really pushing hard around safety. Again, this is often also tied to things like poorly created lag indicator metrics and targets around safety. So, we're going to set a target of 1 year incident free, but we're not going to focus on how we get there. So therefore, that cynicism is just reinforced within those employees. So some very clear and I think easy to understand drivers of negative safety cultures. The resource that we'll share with you at the end of this webinar gives you a link to an ebook which highlights and identifies all of this data in more detail and actually gives you some hints and tips as to how to address or start to address some of these. So now let's learn from sites that are going well. Sites that are going well, so these are sites that were in the private compliance and above levels of safety maturity, tended to have the following areas that they did really well. The first one is they had a clear safety mission and vision that was related back to regularly by leaders. So leaders would tie back jobs and tasks to the safety mission, to the safety vision. They would often have reward recognition schemes set up around behaviours and values that support this also. But the first key point was everyone understands what we're aiming for and they all talk about it regularly. This was reinforced by that safety management commitment. So this is examples where managers were talking about that mission and then engaging in behaviours that reflected the sentiment of that mission. So it might have been, having a consistent approach to safety, whether we're in a high pressure situation or operation as normal. It would be about constantly going out and looking at the good stuff as well as the not so great stuff. It'd be about closing the feedback loops. Within team communication was also a strength. So people were more likely to share, speak up, challenge one another and look and communicate about the best way to get the job done. Safety responsibility was another real strength there. So individuals within this type of organisation felt a greater ownership of safety and their own responsibility. And team safety support was the last one. So here it was this focused on how much people believe that safety was supported by their team and one of the critical focuses in getting the job done safely. So yeah, as you can see, they're very, very different focus areas and outcomes for those more mature sites. What we're going to do now is ask you to reflect on how your organisation is performing against these 5 areas of strength. And we'll give you some ideas about how you can tackle each of them and in terms of improving them. So we're going to kick off by having a look at the idea of a shared vision. Now, a shared vision is important because we crave direction, consistency, and fairness. When expectations are clear, it's easy for people to know what good looks like and they feel more empowered to speak up. It also has significant implications from what we call a social brain example. People want to know what's expected of them, and if they don't, they can actually experience a threat response. So having a shared vision that is spoken about and communicated clearly from all levels of the organisation plays into an energised approach to safety. So this is a quote from, again, one of the organisations we work with. Safe work is a message people think of when they think of our safety vision. So again, that particular organisation was using safety as a lever for its overall cultural performance. So an opportunity for you to think about this and reflect for yourself is how well is your vision integrated into regular processes and meetings? So I'll get you to have a bit of a think about this particular question. I'll ask Sarah to pop the first poll up on the screen. How well is your vision integrated into regular processes and meetings? A little, not at all, somewhat, and well. Just had a thought. Some people might not even have a clear safety mission on their site. If that's the case for you, then I'd probably tick a little or not at all.
All right, just a few more seconds, Anthony, just allow people to.
Right.
I think some people have to actually think about this before they answer. Very interesting. All right. Okay, I'm going to end that now.
Okay, so we've got some interesting results there. So we've got somewhat at 41%, so nearly half, and then approximately the other half at not at all or a little. Okay, very interesting results. And then we've got 9%, so a smaller proportion who say they do it well. So for those of us who aren't doing it as well as we would like to be doing it, here's a couple of examples of how we can apply the thinking around a vision, communicating a clear vision to an organization or to the people within your organization. First of all, we need to understand the why of that vision. So we need to be able to explain the why safety is important to our business and our outcomes and what we're trying to achieve, but also help them to uncover their personal why for safety as well. So we often talk about the concept at Sentis of the personal big five. So the 5 most important things, people, places, or situations to each of us. So our challenge would be, as you communicate the why, talk about why this is important to the organization, but also encourage people to link their own personal whys to that vision as well. The next one is be accountable for driving enthusiasm and ownership of the vision. So again, the more we talk about the vision and the more engaged we are in the vision, then the better outcomes we tend to see. So where we've got frontline leaders all the way up to executives who are personally sharing why safety is important to them as well as why it's important to the organization, we see an increased perception of authenticity and we see an increased perception of accountability around safety, because you're putting it out there and makes it much more difficult to not walk the talk. The next point here is integrate the vision into meetings and pre-starts to help keep it front in mind. So again, it's not about being awkward and reading a vision statement off a piece of paper, but it's about constantly linking back to the type of organization we want, the type of place we want to create, and why we want to get people home safe. And then finally, provide detailed and regular feedback to workers on their behavior as it relates to the vision. So this is where values can become a really useful lever for leaders to use. We spend, this is a whole nother webinar that's coming up soon, but we spend so much time focusing on rewarding and recognizing around hard metrics, lost time injury frequency rates or production outcomes or reporting incidents. We can often miss the rewarding and recognizing the why. So if we can be very clear about the values that support the vision and the behaviors that demonstrate those values and how they tie to the why, and we can reward and recognize people for their positive behaviors towards getting things done, we can start to create a very different conversation. We can start to reward and recognize the positive behaviors linked to the values that support us to achieve that vision. So again, it's about digging a little bit deeper than your traditional safety metrics and production metrics, and thinking about, well, what do we want to see people actually doing and how do we recognize that effectively in the moment? Okay, the next one we're going to uncover a little bit more is about safety management commitment. So as leaders, unfortunately, or fortunately, we're constantly under scrutiny. And in fact, one of my first leaders told me, Anthony, people can't hear what you're saying because what you're doing is speaking so loudly. So people are constantly assessing you for trust and credibility. They're seeing whether your actions match the words that you say. So positive safety culture is created when leaders are trusted and respected by their teams, and there's clear safety management commitment. Safety is talked about a lot, and they put it first. So this is where we're constantly coming back to what's the best and safest way to get this job done. So we're going to untap this a little bit further, and I'm going to ask you again for another poll. What we tend to find is that the relationship or the perception of management's commitment to safety is linked between the relationship between the frontline and safety management and the perceptions of one another. So what does the relationship between management and the frontline look like for your organization? So is it hostile interactions, counterproductive safety behaviors? Is this when people actively speak up and are antagonistic at safety meetings or at pre-start meetings? Is it an us versus them procedures followed only under supervision? So is there a different culture when leaders are on the site versus off the site, or people are being watched or not being watched? Is it an aligned relationship where people follow the rules even when they're unsupervised, but might not go much beyond that? Is it cooperative approach to safe work? So are we brainstorming across the organization the best way to get things done? Or is it a high trust relationship with shared goals of safety citizenship? So I'll give you a moment to reflect. Of course, there's going to be cultures and subcultures across your organization, but as a whole, which one of these comments do you think would best, I guess, reflect your organizational culture? Of course, the poll is anonymous.
Okay, just a couple more seconds. All right, I think I'll share that now.
Sarah? Right, okay, well, so some interesting results there. So we've got 24%, 8% in the high levels, that's excellent. And then another 28% in the aligned relationship. So the aligned relationship would typically be the private compliance and above. So that's great. So we've got over half of the group who, well, exactly 60% who have gone over that tipping point, which is excellent. Then we've got a fair chunk of people sitting in that us versus them culture, and a couple sitting in the hostile interaction space as well. So not reflective of our own survey results, but of course we've got a broad sample group that's on here. Interesting and excellent to see that there's a number of organizations sitting at that private compliance and above. So in terms of thinking about how do we address moving more organizations to the right-hand side or to the more mature areas of safety culture, a couple of things to think about. First of all, review incentives tied to production. What messages do they send? The challenge with just focusing on the output of a particular set of scenarios is we can sometimes reward behaviors we don't want to see. So thinking about how do we balance getting the production targets and driving the right behaviors and attitudes in the getting of those production targets is critical. Hence talking about values and behaviors that we spoke about a little bit earlier. The next one here is to provide easy to access budget to ensure safe work. So in a number of organizations where commitment is seen as strong, they've decluttered the procurement process. They've identified that people being able to purchase, at a reasonable level and in a reasonable way, the tools to get the job done and to cut out bureaucracy. It works really, really well. What we've also found is that in these organizations, senior managements in the finance part of the business understand their role in relation to creating a safe culture, a culture of safe work as well. Versus the organizations where they're less mature, where the finance and certain functions of business don't see how they contribute. The next one here is spend time getting to know your team and establish trust and meaningful relationships. So in organizations in the more mature space, we tend to see higher levels of trust and more meaningful relationships. And this has an impact on things like reporting, collaboration, and sharing of ideas. And finally, ask your team for feedback on how you can support their safety and develop their skills. So as part of the in-field interaction processes or as part of regular team engagement, managers see it as their role not only to catch people doing the wrong thing, but to actually look at how they can add value to the workforce. So it's not about catching people doing the wrong thing. It's about, well, what's working, what's not working, how can we make your job easier? What are some of the hazards that you can see that we perhaps can't see? All right, so to cover off on the next topic, the next topic is within team safety communication. So this is a frequency or quality of safety messages and discussions within teams to support strong within team communication. So an example of a quote that comes from sites that do this well is we discover lots of things, people start talking, staff highlight challenges as well as improvements, and we adapt. It's a chance for staff to speak up about concerns. So this is a really collaborative focus to safety. And what it taps into is some really useful and practical brain science. And that is that our brains don't all see the same thing. It's a concept called inattentional blindness. So 2 of us can be looking at the same thing, or 3 of us, or 4 of us, and some of us may miss something where others don't. And I'm sure many people on the call will have seen examples of the gorilla video with the bouncing basketballs or different inattentional blindness videos that have shown you this example. If you're not familiar with this concept, then Google after this unintentional blindness or send me a note and I can flick something through to you. But really what they're talking about here is they've created a culture and a set of questions and an environment which enables people to collaborate and brainstorm about what they've seen, talk about it, and put controls into place around those particular hazards, or fix them completely. So it's a very different type of culture, and it enables us to tap into the brain power of everyone within the group, hence avoiding as much of that inattentional blindness as possible. So a quick poll for you, again, is what is the best example of within team safety communication that you've seen? Actually, no, this isn't a poll. I'll ask you to pop it into the comments. So what is the best example of within team communication that you've seen recently? All right, I'll give people a question to put those, an opportunity to put those in. I've got a comment here. I wonder if the polls would work. This is from Britta. Would work different if we ask the same questions to the frontline workers. So the data that we're sharing here is largely asked of the frontline workers. So probably they're the most representative group of all of the data that we're putting through. So a lot of the feedback we're giving here is about reporting up about people's perception of safety management, as well as frontline leaders as well. So just wait to see if there's any comments of great examples of within team safety communication that people have seen. But while we're waiting for that, I'll share a couple of the hints and tips again. Firstly, it's about reviewing your safety briefing. So organizations are doing this well. Review their safety briefings, make sure that they're relevant, useful, and engaging for both permanent workers and contractors. So they typically make them standing, short and sharp, generally have some sort of visual board behind them, and they're actively seeking to engage with the group. So very on the flip side, in that more counterproductive space, we tend to see a lot of bigger groups, lots of people not engaged in the conversations, maybe sunglasses on, drinking their iced coffee, very different. So it's about, as to the next point, engage as much two-way communication during safety briefings as we possibly can. Next one here is using safety briefings as an opportunity to learn and reflect. So using safety briefings in a way that enables us to ask, well, what went well yesterday? What didn't go so well yesterday? What can we learn from that? And how can we apply that to the day moving forward? And then finally, this works well where we recognize workers who talk about safety outside of formal forums. So this is about actively going and hunting the good stuff here, and identifying, well, if someone's bringing up safety in not in an unusual example, or an example that isn't a structured or formal setting, how do we recognize and reward that? So this is coming back to that initial point about looking at the behaviors and the values that support the vision and mission. Okay, I've just seen what's come through. So I've got a couple of people here have made a couple of comments. So relevant example of issue with solution focus. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Carly. If you wouldn't mind giving me a bit more info, that'd be great. And the skill of communicator to also engage empathy. Okay, yeah. So definitely, I think when it comes to us talking to the workforce, doing so in a way that is authentic and empathetic and seeks to understand before being understood is incredibly important. So couldn't agree more with that as a skill for effective leadership commitment. Okay, the next one we're going to tackle is safety responsibility. So this talks about the amount of discretionary effort that workers are willing to put into safety activities and their sense of ownership that they have over safety in the organization. So the guys will say, no, I'm not doing that, and the team will support it. So this is about actively supporting people to put safety first. So a reflection for your organization, how would you rate the current level of safety responsibility in your business? Would it be very low, moderate, high, or very high? So do people believe that safety is the safety team's responsibility, or do they truly believe it's up to them? Or, what sort of language do you hear around safety? Do you see people saying, well, my 50% or my portion of responsibility here is to do this? Or do you hear a lot of excuse making and shifting of the blame? Even if there's an incident occurs, how do management talk about that incident? Do they talk about the silly people at the front line, or do they first of all ask themselves what they did or what the organization did to contribute to this particular incident? Because they're very different types of conversations. Organizations that typically sit in the high and very high have individuals and leaders that ask themselves about their role and responsibility in whatever's happened first, before looking at what the other impacts were or the other influencing factors were as well. So how would you rate the current level of safety responsibility in your business?
Okay, just a few more. All right, I'll share that now.
Great, thank you, Sarah. All right, so we've got, again, a bit of a mixed bag. We've got moderate sitting as the most significant proportion, and then high. So we've got a lot of people believing that they have individuals within their organization taking a lot of personal responsibility for safety. So a couple of tips for those who are performing well to even perform better, or for those who are perhaps in the lower areas to perform a little bit stronger. The application considerations here are to help workers understand how safety relates to their personal goals, teammates, and the organization. So again, linking back safety to, as you can see the next point there, that personal why. Let's talk about why we want to get this job done safely, what that means for us and what it means for the organization. And then of course, leading by example, and that perceived commitment, management commitment to safety becomes critical. So looking at opportunities to actively engage and support people to engage with safety is absolutely mission critical. Last but not least is team support for safety. So this talks to the quality of relationships between team members, the level of care and concern for each other, and the willingness to confront a co-worker if something's not particularly safe. If I had someone talk to me about something I shouldn't have been doing, I was really thankful it was well received. So I'm going to ask you to have a think about how this plays out in your organization. How likely are your team members to challenge a peer on a poor safety standard? Not at all, unlikely, somewhat likely, likely, or very likely. I remember running a program on a mine site in rural New South Wales a number of years ago, and I had a new operator on the site, and he'd climbed up onto a piece of particular equipment and actually had one of his colleagues call him down and say, mate, that's not the way we do things around here. Do the job properly, do it safely. And he shared with the group that at the time of the conversation, he was quite put out, because that's the way he's an experienced operator. That's the way he'd done it at previous sites he'd worked at. And to be actually called out by his peer for engaging in something that wasn't a particularly safe behaviour, he found quite confronting at the start. But then he shared that as he reflected, he was really grateful for that, and he was more likely to challenge his colleagues on the same thing, because what it demonstrated was an active care for his safety. So, Sarah, I'll ask you to share, what are the results of that poll? So we've got, again, a bit of a mixed bag there. So we've got a 25% in likely, somewhat likely, might depend on the person and the situation and the comfort level of the person, and we've got unlikely and not at all, also significantly represented there. So if this is an area of opportunity for your organisation, some of the things to think about is actively promote and frame difficult conversations as an opportunity to learn and seek understanding rather than attribute blame. So there's a conversational framework that we would normally give to individuals and leaders as about how to bring up these challenging things in a way that doesn't completely confront the person being spoken to. And as we saw with one of the comments in the question and answer section, having a level of empathy is critical. So if we can go in and seek to understand why someone's doing something in particular, why they've made a particular decision to do something, then it can often soften the conversation, help us understand where they're coming from, and potentially uncover a further set of challenges or opportunities. It can also stop us making a fool of ourselves as well. A leader on another site I was doing a walk around with came across a guy doing some welding, and this is in North Queensland. The rule on that site was about double eye protection. We came across a guy who didn't have double eye protection, but instead of that leader, doing what probably everyone thought they would or should do and addressing that particular person sternly, they actually stopped and asked the question. Oh, I thought the policy here was to wear double eye protection. I've just noticed you're not any. Can you help me understand why you're not? And the welder comes back and he says, well, once it gets over a particular temperature, double eye protection becomes more of a risk because of a fogging issue. So we're at that point now. So that's why I'm not wearing double eye protection. I normally would. So that actually created a really good opportunity for a broader conversation around safety. And it meant that instead of further perpetuating a culture of blame and mistrust, it actually was an opportunity to create trust and to help that particular person feel like they were engaged effectively. The next one to consider is think about who lives your values, who is living your mission the best, and pair new workers with them. If we can instill those positive attitudes and frames in people earlier, that's more likely to carry on throughout their experience at that site. We will all have experienced this before. The initial frames we're handed around people or situations tend to be the most sticky. So if we can onboard people effectively and we can pair them up well at the start, then we can ingrain some good positive habits. And then finally, get to know what makes your team tick to recognize their focus and safety might be at risk. So understand, what are the drivers? When do they get frustrated? Is it particular times of the night? Is it particular times of the month? Is it when production pressure gets up? When are the high risk periods where people might take shortcuts, or as Sarah mentioned earlier, when they might become more complacent, and look to actively address those particular periods. So there's some tips that you can think about to drive a more positive safety culture within your organisation. Of course, these slides will be sent out and there'll be an additional supporting resource as well. If you want to continue to drive a more positive safety culture, we suggest a scientific practitioner model to understanding the key levers to pull. In fact, we see a lot of organisations burn a lot of time and money and effort just guessing what the next best thing to focus on in relation to safety is. What we encourage you to do is to first of all collect data, understand what's actually happening within your workforce so you can understand the drivers of that cultural performance. Now, obviously we suggest using a structured process for this. Depending on where your culture is at, you may be able to run some focus groups yourself, or sometimes it can be useful to get a third party in to get that data and give you back to collect that data in a safer environment to give you a clear understanding of what's actually happening. We also really strongly support creating a positive steering committee. So having a group of people represented from across the organisation, safety and operations, to ensure that any recommendations or areas of focus out of that data collection are activated and supported broadly. Creating a strategy, you will all have business strategies. What we would suggest is a safety culture strategy. What's your 3-year goals? What's your annual priorities? And what are your quarterly rocks? And how do you get really clear with accountabilities and responsibilities and communicate your achievements to the workforce? Of course, implementing the plan comes to structure, comes to discipline and structure around the steering committee meeting regularly. And then what we'd recommend is that as you are implementing change within your organisation, run little pulse surveys regularly. If you've addressed a particular area of concern, ask people about it 3 or 6 months later to see whether what you've done has addressed the issues that they raised at the start. If you're interested in understanding a little bit more about this, you can go to our website, sentis.com.au/insights, and you can download the report in full. It's a huge report. It's about 70 or 80 pages worth of really useful content that dives a lot deeper than I did today into everything that we've shared. I think Sarah will be sending out the link as part of the email around afterwards as well. So you can probably click on it through there if you would like. Opportunity now for some Q&A. So I'll run through a couple of things while we're waiting for any questions to come through. But if you do have any questions, feel free to put them down and I will answer them once we've gone through the next couple of slides. Couple of polls for you. What we are running is an executive roundtable coming up soon. We've got a couple of spaces left on the April version of this. It's about driving safety to protect brand and reduce risk. So these are 90-minute interactive work groups targeting the C-suite. So we've got a number of people represented from a number of different organisations, and it gives us an opportunity to meet with industry peers, understand what's working from their side, what's not working, ask questions, network and connect further. So if you're interested in getting involved in that conversation, click yes on the screen, or alternatively click no. If you click yes, we'll just have one of our team members get in contact with you to sign you up to make sure that you get a seat on that table.
Okay, while we're waiting for any questions, I've just shared a link to upcoming webinars and also a note there that all our previous webinars are also on that page, including a few by Anthony and the team at Sentis as well. So you just need to scroll down to find those. So we haven't got any questions as yet. I'm just going to put the final poll up for you, Anthony. And but yet we have got a couple of minutes left if anyone does want to ask questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another free opportunity here to do our Zip Essentials trial here. If you'd like to jump online to understand more of our psychological approach, again, click yes, and we'll get in contact with you and sign you up for a free demo of that particular resource. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me on LinkedIn and I'll get back to you promptly.
Good. Okay, well, I'll leave that poll open. I don't think we have any questions coming up. Reminder that later today, I'm not sure when, depends how long the video takes, but we will send out those resources Anthony mentioned and a podcast of this presentation and a video. And obviously Anthony's contact details.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Sarah, again for hosting us.
Thank you, Anthony. One of the comments just made, thank you very much, very helpful. So great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
See
you all.
next week.
Take care.
Bye.